The book of the week from last week that I'll talk about tonight is A Sense of Self by Veronica O'Keane. A Sense of Self, Memory, the Brain, and Who We Are. And actually, if you are in, I think, the UK, the book might be called The Rag and Bone Shop. Actually, it's a different title, so when I was looking it up, I found that out. But here in the States, it's called A Sense of Self by Veronica O'Keane. Very, very fascinating book. I really enjoyed it. Dr. O'Keane is a professor of psychiatry and a consultant psychiatrist at Trinity College, Dublin. And in the book, she shares from the neuroscience research, but also draws from her, I think, 35 plus years of seeing patients in psychiatry, and also actually shares from literature and different writers, poets, and some of their thoughts on themes that come up throughout the book. So it made it a quite fascinating read, interesting, also very human, although she's a psychiatrist and describes and discusses some harrowing cases that are very intense and extreme. You feel a very human type of connection, relationship that she seems to have with her patients, which I appreciated. So just the title itself really drew me, A Sense of Self, and looking at memory when discussing a sense of self. And to my understanding, or in my estimation, when we think of a sense of self, I think of who I am, it has to be based in memory. Or if we put it the other way around, without memory, I cannot really have a sense of self, of who I am. It's in a way composed of my memories. That's how I even can understand myself. So to me, that really stood out and makes a lot of sense. And that theme does come up in the book in various ways, but just something to think about, that if you really consider it, how could you have a sense of yourself if you did not have memory? And as she also explains in the book in discussing some of her patients, although we take it for granted, this sense of self that we have, not everyone has a sense of self. And some people with severe mental illnesses, such as schizophrenia, and some people with schizophrenia might not even feel like they are themselves or have a sense of who they are. So, as often is the case, many things that we take for granted or we don't notice become more apparent, or we can feel grateful when we recognize that not everyone has that experience that we didn't even realize was something we could not have until we see some people who might not actually have that benefit of that experience. So the first part of the book gets into some of the neuroscience of memory and understanding who we are, and how memories are made. I like that she talked about the brain-mind divide, which I find a little bit complex, or it's made complex when it maybe is not that complex. When people think of the mind as something different from the brain, one way of looking at it is the mind is the experience of having a brain. But often we have these abstract or mythical, religious, spiritual explanations for things, not necessarily because they are that, but it often means we just don't understand it yet. So, for example, a feeling of love is an incredible feeling, and it can make you feel this amazing thing that it makes us think it's something spiritual or has to be from God. And this is not saying it can't be from God in some other way if you want to have that religious belief, but that it could be created in the brain, that experience. And when we understand the brain more, as neuroscience and related fields has uncovered in recent decades, we can see how this develops in the brain, or how it is expressed in the brain. Now, this is what creates the issues when we're trying to understand consciousness, that we have to think of what is the problem, or what are we trying to explain. So here we have this problem of what does it mean to experience something, and how do you define it? But as far as seeing it in the brain, we can understand it. It doesn't have to be something that happens outside of the brain. So some philosophers and people throughout history, and even still, hold this notion that there is a brain, but there's parts of human experience, maybe you call it the soul, or you call it other things that have to be happening outside of the brain because we can't explain it. But often I think it's this that we don't know yet, or at that time we didn't know. But as we advance in science, we can understand these things better. And at the same time, to me, this doesn't take away from the experiences. Some people think that if you do this kind of a reductive exploration, let's say, as I said, love, let's say maternal love, that it takes away something from that. And I don't think that has to be the case. Even actually yesterday I saw my cousin's baby, Colette, who was incredibly cute. And I was actually, because I was reading this book and getting close to the end of it and looking at her, I was thinking, there's probably some kind of an explanation of why she is so cute to me, why she brings these feelings in me. We have parental type of instincts. We have instincts or desires to take care of things that are smaller or that look helpless. And there's certain proportions, having a larger head and larger eyes, that bring up this feeling of being younger and needing help more. So there's more, and there's many more that I don't know, and many more maybe we still don't know. But even in knowing that this was happening in my brain, and even some parts of evolution could help explain it, to me didn't take away from my experience of enjoying her and how cute she was and how she made me feel in that way of interacting with her or just seeing her. So to me, it doesn't actually have to take away from it the more we understand these things. I think for some people, the sense that, well, it's no longer mystical because if you feel like it's something spiritual, whatever that means to you, or something bigger than humans or bigger than biology, that's what makes it special. And now if we bring it down to just experience or bring it down to biological explanations, it takes away from it. To me, I don't actually experience it in that way. I think when we understand it, you're in an intellectual space, and that takes away from the experience. If every time you hugged your loved one, all you do is describe the oxytocin and different neurotransmitters being released, that's a way of intellectualizing and escaping the experience in that moment. But understanding these things, I think, is actually really good and wonderful. But then when you experience them, yes, I think it can be important to stay in that experience and enjoy the beauty of whatever it is you experience. So she does touch on that very briefly, definitely more briefly than I touched on it right now. And then also gets into these different aspects of memory, the parts of the brain that are very important. For example, the hippocampus, which helps integrate sensory memory. She also talks, and even biographical memory in a way, the senses and how we experience them, which sensing she puts at very much the center of memory, in the sense that, no pun intended, that what we're doing when we have memory of anything is it's really if you want to call it a snapshot, although it's more alive than that, to think it's frozen in that way, but of an experience of all of your senses, from the five senses, which includes touch, that also includes the internal touch, so the exteroceptive and the interoceptive touch that we can have or experience of that sensation. Really, it's all of that all together that can get encoded as a memory. So senses are very much at the center of our memory experience, which I think definitely makes sense. And memory itself is something that we often think of as I even said snapshot or some kind of a recording, but really it's none of those things. Anytime we remember something, it's a reconstructive process, and even just constantly our memories are changing. And it's a far cry from what even not that long ago people thought was an explanation of memory as some kind of a filing cabinet. So people will sometimes still think that the way we remember is you say, okay, remember this time, 3 weeks ago this happened. And it's as if we go into our brain, find the file of 3 weeks ago, pull it out, and then the whole memory of that experience is there. But this is not what is happening in our brains, and this is not at all explain memory. There is no filing cabinet, and there is no sense that we have this true memory of what happened that we could describe and say is definitely the truth, that I know what happened because I have it in a memory. So it's not a recording. I've heard even people say in different types of, less now, but reading it in books even, of their idea of memory, that everything you've ever experienced is recorded and you can access it and bring it out. So from your 5th birthday, you could, if you thought hard enough or through hypnosis or some process, get to that memory and bring it out faithfully and remember exactly what happened and experience, and it would be very true. And this is not at all our understanding of how memory works now. It is not something that you can just necessarily conjure up in that way, or that is hidden and can faithfully express something that happened however long ago, even more recently than that. One thing that this reminds me of is experience of family therapy and also couples therapy, where if I'm working with a couple and they're going to tell me about an argument they had last week, and so really I always know I'm going to have to let them both share the story of this argument. And I even tell them it's not because either one of them is lying or I think they're intentionally lying, but our experiences and our memory of the events will be different without trying, just because we are two different people. And even the way I said it, experience, because of how you experienced it, or the senses come into play, it's going to affect how you remember what happened. And sometimes it's quite fascinating. Someone will share the story, this happened and this happened, I said this, she said this, and all that, and the other person's like, what are you talking about? And then they'll say the same story, and let's say, no, you did this first, then I did that. And so it can also be hard, sometimes you think, well, what really happened? And without having a video tape of the argument, we won't know for sure. We really are left a lot of times with the experiences being what we have to deal with and work with. And hopefully there's some level of overlap of the experiences, but it does point to this notion that even for recent events, memory is not this thing that you can just conjure up a faithful reproduction of exactly what happened. Really what you're doing is you're trying to bring up or see if what can be triggered is your experience of it, but then also throughout time, by bringing it up, for sure we know that changes the memory, but even as you change and evolve and as time goes on, we know that your memory of experiences is going to change. So we have to remove this notion that we have this file cabinet, or file cabinet of files, or even just file cabinet of recordings that we can bring them out and see and experience the whole thing again. That's not how things work when it comes to our memory. I actually think the way that we can try to understand memory, yes, we remember everything that happened, but not in the sense that we can bring back these accounts that perfectly reflect what happened, but that because of how our brains and bodies work, we know that what we experience influences how our brain develops, influences what we expect to experience, our brains as a predicting machine. So as a result, yes, you in a way remember because you encode all of these experiences that now can affect your future experiences, but that's very different from meaning that you can bring back a memory and describe exactly what happened as long as you're able to access that file in some way. So I'm going to continue discussion after the break on A Sense of Self by Veronica O'Keane. We'll be right back. Welcome back, continuing the discussion on the book A Sense of Self by Veronica O'Keane. And I was talking about the fidelity of memory, or the truth or reliability of memory, and there's so much evidence showing that it is not as reliable as we might think. Now, of course, even having this conversation, we can say it's amazing what we can remember still, or what we're able to do with memory. But when we think of it as this faithful tape recorder, that's where we can lose sight of really the truth about memory. And speaking about truth about memory, there was a whole chapter she had about true and false memories, and she has false in quotes, because as she puts it, really we can think that all memories in a sense are false to a degree. in the sense that no memories are exactly going to be true. We might think that they are, or we think that there's really true ones and completely fake ones, but we have to have that recognition that all of our memories, as much as they might seem very real, they are in some sense a recreation or more of our experience than something that we can say is completely a faithful representation. So I thought it was interesting, that perspective of recognizing that about memory, that it isn't something that is going to be blanketly true or false, but that all of our experiences in a way and all the things we remember are in some ways false to a degree, because it's something that is experienced in our way, but then also evolves over time as well. And related to that, as I mentioned, she shares some case studies in her over 30 years work as a psychiatrist with different patients. And there's this case of Edith, who we can be assured it's not her actual name, but Edith is experiencing postpartum psychosis. So this is when a mother, after giving birth, experiences psychotic symptoms, hallucinations or delusions, or delusions. And it's actually more common than you might think. I heard her speaking, and I believe the statistic she gave was 1 in 200 live births can result in postpartum psychosis, which is more than I realized. I maybe had seen that number before, but it didn't really strike me like it did when I heard her speaking about it, because as I heard her describe, oftentimes and very naturally, and it actually is good, mothers, as all of us in different conditions that we're in, we're told of all sorts of risks. This can happen, and oftentimes we're told of risks that are probably less than a 1 in 200 chance as a possible complication or something we have to think about or be concerned about can develop. But I think postpartum psychosis, because we do have this huge stigma when it comes to psychosis of having a hallucination or delusion, let's say hearing voices that are not part of the shared reality, or feeling something or smelling something that is not part of shared reality, or having a belief that you're experiencing something that is very much not real, like the FBI is after you or something like that. We have such a stigma that I think people are afraid to, first of all, discuss it if they've been through it, but also just to talk about it, even I think for professionals to bring it up, that this could happen to you, because we think that it's something so bad to have, and to suggest that someone might experience it can make them seem like we're saying you might be susceptible to something. So I don't know if that's exactly what's going on, but I do think there are these types of reasons because of the stigma attached to mental illness in general, but especially more what we consider severe mental illness and experiences of mental illness, such as psychosis, that we tend to avoid talking about it. So 1 in 200 is not so rare, and it's probably from a host of factors, including the rush of different types of hormones that the new mother will experience from the pregnancy, and then also birth and post-birth, that contribute to what is going on, because Edith in this case did not have any kind of really significant or any mental illness to speak of before this experience. So this is an important story in the sense that it shows, as I'll demonstrate, something that really struck Dr. O'Keane when it came to memory and our experience of memory. And so Edith had what is called Capgras syndrome, which is this sense that your baby is an imposter. So this is not my baby, the baby that you now have. So it's this like idea of the changeling, that they've switched your baby at birth. And so she didn't believe that her baby was hers. And I think even she thought she smelled in a certain way, which is likely another hallucination. You can have olfactory hallucinations as well, meaning that you smell something that is not there. I remember when I was doing an internship at a psychiatric hospital, my heart would break that there was this one man who he thought he smelled very bad, he didn't actually, but he thought he had this really putrid odor that he was smelling. And when he would talk during the group therapy, he would actually apologize to everyone and to the staff that I'm sorry that I'm doing this, but he in fact did not have an odor, but he had this olfactory hallucination that made him think he was giving off this very, very bad smell. And so here Edith, in this case of Dr. O'Keane that she shares, thought her baby was an imposter, and so they finally take her to the hospital because of her postpartum psychosis. And on the way to the hospital, she sees they pass by a cemetery, and she sees a small gravestone, or a grave that is kind of tilted a little bit, and that small gravestone she looks at, and because there's a little bit of an opening or a movement in her, what looks like it's moved, she says, oh, they must have put my baby there. My real baby is there in that gravestone, and I now have this imposter baby. And it was, of course, a very terrifying experience. So now she goes in the hospital, and after time of taking some antipsychotic medications, her postpartum psychosis relieves or slowly goes away, and now she's leaving the hospital. But now on one of her, or she leaves and goes home, on one of her visits to see the doctor again on a follow-up, she sees the gravestone again, the small gravestone that she initially thought that's where they've buried my actual baby. And she has this experience that, of course, is going to be hard to describe, that she sees it again and feels again what she felt then. But it's a bit complicated because for a moment she does think maybe her baby is there, but when she sees the doctor and she brings this up, the doctor says, well, you know, that was your hallucination. It's not real that your baby was switched and was buried there. And she says, yes, I know that, but the memory is real. And this really struck Dr. O'Keane, and I think it's really a poignant understanding that, of course, we know that it's not based on fact, but you can imagine she experienced it as real in that moment. And imagine the terror of thinking your baby has been taken from you, switched, killed, and now is in a gravestone in the cemetery, and you've seen it. That, of course, is going to be a type of traumatic experience of thinking that, experiencing that. And so seeing the gravestone again, as memory works, it triggered that experience again. And so it brought back that whole sensation. And so Dr. O'Keane says that this was a really interesting, and for her, mind-blowing or mind-opening type of experience of seeing and understanding memory in a different way. So I thought that was quite fascinating, one of the interesting vignettes that Dr. O'Keane shares in this book. And so she also talks about stress. And so stress is something that when I even just say the word, we think of something very negative. Oh, stress. I'm stressed. And of course, having too much stress is very bad and does have negative effects on us, both mentally and physically. But what stress really is actually something quite good in moderate amounts, in the sense that it relates to our level of arousal. So like many things that we see in a biological experience of life, too little of something is bad and too much of it is bad, but we need a moderate or balanced amount. And stress is the same thing, especially when it comes to things like encoding or having memory, in the sense that you have to be at a certain level of arousal or alertness to have the possibility of experiencing something, to remember it. So this reminds me of when you meet someone, and for a lot of people who say they're bad with names, what's really happening is when they meet someone, they're hyper aroused in the sense that they're too anxious, so the brain cannot really process what it's taking in. We can say maybe it didn't fully experience what's happening in that moment, so you never fully took in that name. So we would say this is on the too much arousal. But probably not when you're meeting someone, but in other experiences, you're not paying enough attention, you're under aroused, so to speak. There's not enough stress, and so as a result, you won't even take in that information either in a different way. You're not paying enough attention, we can say. So it was interesting that she does express this concept of stress, not thinking of it as just a bad thing. Of course, it can be when it's too much, and that's what we discuss a lot, and there's a lot of research on that, but that this doesn't necessarily mean that stress is bad. It means that when it's too much, it's not good. There's also a lot of discussion, the theme throughout the book, or a theme I should say, which is true of anything really looking at neuroscience, is that the brain is plastic throughout life, and there's changes that take place in the brain that will, or are experiences that affect our brains and how we experience life and experience different things. And so she talks about starlings, these birds, and how for the males, when it comes time for spring, there's testosterone that gets released in their brain to make the songbird, which really isn't a part of their brain, but a songbird cortex, get bigger, because then they need to sing to, in a way, impress the female starlings to then mate and then, reproduce. And so as a result, we see this change in their brain that seems to be triggered by the sun, which, when the seasons are changing, prepares them for this. We actually see a change in the size of the cortex, or that part of their cortex that relates to singing, so that they can sing a longer song, because the longer the song they can sing, the more that is attractive to the starlings. So it's kind of interesting, showing an example from the animal kingdom, but that we can see similar things happen in our brain in different ways, maybe not as specific as we see there, but I thought that was quite interesting. And then going back to this title of the book, A Sense of Self, again, that's the US title, we do have this tendency not just to have memories, but we do make a story where we self-narrativize this story of ourself. We make a cohesive story that makes sense to us, and this is part of our sense of self, or it can be. And so I think it's interesting because we do make this self-narrative of our life and ourselves, which might be needed to some degree, but also it can limit us, because we tend to think, well, I'm not the kind of person that does this, or I'm not this type of a person, because of what we've experienced, but also probably because we want to be seen and we want to feel that I am this kind of person and not that kind of person. And sometimes this might actually limit our experiences, or limit what we do, the behaviors that we do. So this reminds me of Jung's concept of the shadow, where because of things you experience in childhood for different reasons, you might disown parts of yourself. So for example, there was a lot of anger in your home and it really looked bad, and you had bad experiences because of it, and you didn't want to be like your parents that were so angry, so you disown your angry part of yourself, or your anger, which can be and is a very healthy part of your psyche, and you've put it away. And so you tell yourself, I'm not a person that gets mad. I don't never get angry. And so as a result, you go through life with this narrative that you're telling yourself, but it might actually prevent you from having healthy expressions of anger, for recognizing that, let's say, your boundaries have been violated, or someone is doing something you don't like, and because of this story that you have of yourself of not being an angry person, you actually won't express that anger, and will maybe tell yourself you're okay, but almost definitely you are feeling something inside that you are not having access to or connecting with. So our self-narration of our life, it does make sense that we tend to do that to make some sort of sense of our lives, but we have to be aware of there can be some costs when I think it's too fossilized. It becomes too inflexible, and we want to have a flexibility in that, to recognize I have been these things, but as Walt Whitman says, I contain multitudes. You can be many different things and many different types of people. And so I think it's important to be aware of that itself, that yes, a sense of self can be important and make sense, but we can at times get ourselves in trouble by having too fixed an understanding of ourself as someone who only is this and is not these things, when we really were likely much more than a story that we even are making up about ourselves, about ourselves. So this book I found incredibly fascinating, brings up lots of different concepts related to memory. First, some of the new neuroscience in memory that shows the role of different parts of the brain, like the hippocampus and the amygdala, when it comes to our experiences and our memory. But I really enjoyed also the writing style of Veronica O'Keane, so highly recommend this book, A Sense of Self, Memory, the Brain, and Who We Are, by Veronica O'Keane. Let's go to our last commercial break. We'll be right back.